RavenDB allows you to quickly and easily store an entire object graph as a single document. While this is useful for many scenarios, sometimes we want to store sub-objects as distinct documents and load the sub-objects only when necessary. To fill this need, Raven provides a method called include as a simple and efficient way to load object relationships on an as-needed basis. Let's look at how this works in code. To illustrate the problem, I've added a new property to our recipe called author, and the author of a recipe is a chef. In our database, we've stored some of these recipes in the database already. For example, recipe 1. Notice how the nested objects, in this case the chef, is contained inside the recipe document. So this is an object graph. And if we go to recipes 2, now I'm in another document, recipes 2, and we see some data duplication here. In this case, Chef Jacqueline is duplicated in both recipes 1 and recipes 2. Sometimes this duplication isn't desirable. For example, imagine you wish to allow chefs to update their email address on your site. You'd have to look through all the recipes for a particular chef, updating multiple recipes along the way, just so that a chef can update his or her email address. And that's not ideal and not particularly efficient. In such a scenario, instead of storing chefs as objects embedded in the recipe, we want to store each chef as its own distinct document having its own ID. And that way there's no data duplication. Then the recipes will just refer to an existing chef object. Let's see how we can make this work. First, let's remove the existing documents since these contain embedded chefs, and we don't want embedded chefs anymore. And let's go to the code. First, we're going to change recipe to contain a reference to a chef. So let's comment out this so that the chef is no longer embedded. And instead, let's have an author ID string. Now let's go over to the chef class. Now that he's going to be a distinct document, he'll have an ID. Now the recipes reference individual chefs rather than embedding them. So let's try this out. So we'll create a new chef. And we'll leave the rest blank, that's fine. And we'll go ahead and store that chef. Now that we've stored a chef, let's create a new recipe that references that chef. And we'll have the author ID be the chef.id. And we'll go ahead and store that as well. And lastly, we'll go ahead and save it all. And we'll run that. And it's done. Let's look at the documents in Raven Studio. So you can see we have two distinct documents here. We have a recipe and we have a chef. And if we go into the recipe, we'll see that its author ID is this string, and there's this related documents that we can jump right over to that guy if we want. How does this work in code? How can we deal with related documents in code? Let's have a look. So what happens when we want to load a recipe with its chef? For example, maybe we want to show a page describing the recipe and the chef's name together. The naive way to do this is to perform two remote calls to the database, one to load the recipe and another to load the chef. And in this case, we're looking for recipe is 33. And then the chef would be session.load the chef, looking at recipe.authorID. And that'll work. If we run this, we should see both. There's our recipe, and there's our chef. Why is this naive? Well, it's not very efficient. We shouldn't have to go to the database twice to get the related objects. Instead, what we would like to do is make a single remote call to Raven to return both the recipe and its related chef. To solve this, Raven introduces the include method. So let's see how this can work. So we'll include from the recipe our.authorID. And the author ID, of course, will be the chef. How do we get access to that chef object? Now you might think, aren't we just making a second remote call here with a load? In fact, we are not making a remote call. How so? Because when we issue this query, Raven will say, he wants to include the author ID. So we'll find a document matching that author ID and then put that into the session loaded objects. So by the time we call .load and ask for this chef by this ID, it's already into the session, and so no remote call is being made. Let's run this and see how it works. Here's our recipe, and as expected, here's our chef. To be clear, we've only made a single remote call, just one, and that's this call. That loads both the recipe as well as the recipe's author ID. Then when we call the second load, it's already in the session. That is, this chef is already loaded into the session, and therefore it doesn't make a remote call. By using the include method, we can load object relationships selectively by choosing which objects to bring over from the database, and efficiently by making a single remote call to bring over an object with the related objects you wish to include.